reputation dilution situation.
Okay, here's a guess for you to predict.
Okay.
It's the month of March,
Why is it
the
not showing?
adequate time needed for it to go away.
I'm not sure. We won't
What-
know.
That's
what's
not
your
supposed to
wish?
happen either.
Prediction.
I
There
think
it
it
is.
will be.
It like
Oh.
goes back and
I don't
forth.
really know. My
Okay.
guess
It's
is
weird.
maybe a month.
April.
I don't know. But I think all of these
I'm
measures
gonna go to
now
the
are
restaurant
gonna
and back
help
in.
make it so that it doesn't spread more. That's exactly why the
Right,
college is doing it. So
Right.
hopefully there will be enough intervention.
Okay,
But this has been going on since the very beginning of the year. So and their cases are just starting to go down.
oh,
So there is, but we're still going up. So,
right, because people are coming out of there.
no, just because it's already here.
Okay. Oh,
I'm not worried, I don't think traveling people are that, I'm not worried about traveling people anymore. It's already here.
right,
Yeah.
right, that's why we're going out, because the traveling people return home.
Yeah, because there's 2 weeks where you could be shedding virus, so with very little symptoms. So this time just gonna be cautious.
I'm surprised that
Just gonna be
the,
cautious.
the public schools haven't, well, I guess it's the parents now,
Yeah.
voluntarily withdrawing their kids.
The hardest is that, if healthcare workers have to stay home with their kids, they can't be at work.
Right.
So then
Okay.
there's a work.
So it should be live and the chat looks like it's working,
That's
so.
one of the reasons and kids are not disproportionately affected. They are not, they're not like dying at high levels, which would be the case in other infectious diseases. Usually they're vulnerable population.
Right, they're the two ends of the lifespan.
Yeah, but they're not,
It's just
the
only
kids are
the-
doing fine.
Only the top end.
Yeah.
With extra
It's the same.
complications, sure. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Take care, Siri.
Okay.
I don't know, that's just because like it's on pause.
Try.
Refresh.
Oh, so, was this, okay, you had selected that, you have to go back to the page, we had to reload the page, so we have to read, so.
I was just clicking it from the email.
So yeah, so it's in the email, look at that, and then,
Oh, okay. But that is how I got the report. Was it just like,
I think it might have been some, because we had to redo the stream link, so something could have been
and
lying.
so somebody signed in, so you have to sign in the chat? Does that mean I'll have to use like my,
Yeah, so whatever your Gmail is, because people must know all of our stuff.
I don't know.
Skynet.
Google, and then we're all just,
Yeah, that's hard. That's great. And so I would create a channel to join the chat?
No.
No.
So how would I say something?
Oh, so,
Create a channel?
Do you know how to open this?
that's
You
ridiculous.
can't unlock it.
Okay,
Lock
So
it.
So I'm gonna have to create a channel to view them?
You'll be able to view them, it's just replying.
Okay.
Oh, you don't need to
Well-
reply, though.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't need to.
I just, because like you made me log in for the channel, and I just wanna make sure that I can, it wants me to create a channel to join the chat.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But like, I just wonder, does that make me not able to go into the chat?
Don't know. If necessary, we can have you do it from our computer. I
I'm
wouldn't have
sure,
thought that would
I'm
be
sure
necessary.
YouTube or Google has everything that I need, I think.
Well,
Okay, I'll just.
so,
Live chat, welcome to live chat.
so it's noon. So the question is, are we live?
Well, it says we are, and this says we are, but hers doesn't have it as live.
It says waiting for digital media services.
Do a refresh of your browser.
I close it and
Oh,
restart
okay.
it.
Yeah, and she had re-clicked the links even. So.
You close out.
Well, because we changed, we
Yeah,
probably
she
changed.
re-clicked it after the.
Let's see what comes
Change.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you did?
Here's say something. Type in, you can ask a
Okay, well,
question.
there might not be that many.
Yeah, because you have to create a YouTube channel.
So now you have a YouTube channel?
I have a YouTube channel.
Okay. So Ruthie just typed into the chat.
Oh, she did?
So I just did a test,
Oh,
but I don't
okay.
see anybody else's.
The,
It says top chat, maybe there's an all chat?
let's see what that live chat.
Oh, but
No, that's not saying anything. Okay. Interesting that it's not showing.
Oh, and it does say one waiting there.
Let's see. That's probably you waiting. I don't know why you're still getting that and not the stream.
I can try,
Go back,
I can try an Internet Explorer. Just to make sure.
go back to the link. So not just a refresh, but let's go back to the link that was sent out. And see.
What's that one? Actually, so Internet Explorer is working,
Oh, yeah. It is.
Oh, you're seeing it in IE?
Yeah.
but not in Chrome. Oh, it says watch YouTube videos with Chrome. Oh, and then, look, and then I can see the question here.
Yeah, okay.
But not yours.
Yeah, well, let me see if I sign in here, if I can type in that.
Interesting, not necessarily in a good way.
It's in the middle chat.
Sorry.
You might be able,
Just put it on the chat and stuff like that. Just like.
to that service.
Okay.
Anyway.
There's also
So, you're seeing it. in
glare on
IE,
the
but not
screen.
Chrome.
So that's weird.
Oh, yeah, so, just curiosity, so the Internet Explorer one, it shows that it started streaming 7 minutes ago,
Uh-huh.
but the Chrome one still says waiting for digital media services.
Yeah,
And it's
that's,
scheduled for March 6th. And my chat didn't go in there, but my IE one did.
yeah, okay.
So that
So,
helps me out.
But you, in order to
Is that
chat, you had
clear?
to create a channel?
Pardon?
You had to create a
And
channel
create a channel.
to chat. That's not a good function.
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, very hard. Oh, there was like a delay, right?
Oh,
there is, there's about a 30-second delay.
yeah, because I see myself.
Yeah.
I was trying to get the screen to be less glary, but, well, it's pretty, like, how much can you see? Like, look, Jen. I
Oh, you're
looked
talking about
through
the projector
thing.
screen?
Yeah.
Then, hang on, that's not so much a projector function. It should be more, how I have the camera set.
Well, does that say 5 are watching now?
There.
Can you see on there?
It's still delayed.
Give it about 30 seconds and you'll see the change that I just made in the camera.
It's weird to see me.
If we need to, we can update the webpage and say, if you're having problems, try Internet Explorer.
Okay.
So in the college
Oh, yeah,
channel
that works.
page, if you go to,
So maybe I can turn the lights back on so people can see
Yeah.
us.
it would be better to leave the lights off
Okay.
so that we can see the screen.
Okay.
But I think we'll still be able to see the presenter.
Yeah, so I can get a number.
So if you want, maybe underneath here, type in,
Okay, so,
if you need
yeah,
to,
so I'm gonna
let's
have
try
to
going
make
to text
So you can't hear me though when I write.
and click down there.
Do you guys have the mute on right now for the live stream?
No. As in you can hear, because, are you able to hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me if I'm here?
Yeah.
Okay, I got sound.
Okay.
So
Go.
we could do, yeah. There's sound.
So for those who are tuning in, you might want to switch your browsers to Internet Explorer. For some reason, we're having trouble getting Chrome to work.
Oh, well, that's better. I can hear you there.
Well, yeah, because I'm in front of the mic. So we're not going to start until 12:30 or a couple minutes after. So just so you all know, thank you so much for tuning in.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Okay, and then update.
You can't see the presenter.
See how it brings up looking. So we still do. Oh, that's the original. Okay. So if you go back
Is
to
this
the
slightly
live
better?
stream, it'll give you some of the analytics. Yay. Of course,
There's two of us, sorry.
3 of us are, because it shows, I think, the original, the page that you're using for monitoring. So I think 3 of us, half of the audience is us. If you could hang here just a moment, I just realized.
We have a note from an audience member that Firefox also works.
Oh, wait a minute, yes, I will. Let me get a little something called E. I'll be back in a minute.
She just has the sound up.
Okay, yeah. I wish we could get feedback from that playing to this
Yeah,
playing.
can you turn it off? Turn your sound off.
Yeah.
Because it'll just be us on a loop. So Chrome really doesn't work. Oh, good. Great.
Chrome's working.
It looks like Chrome is working now.
Okay, cool. Yeah, what happened? The internet gods.
We're still doing it. We're still doing it.
we're looking at other different ways. It's like YouTube's the best one, like, I mean, but it is the most popular one. Oh, yeah.
Are we all good?
Yeah.
Cool. And the chat seems to be working. Okay. Okay.
Okay, so I will make these updates on here. Okay, so do you need any more?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Told those out.
Is the left on this
Yeah.
side, isn't it? Is the other one? Okay. All right, then.
But you can watch it.
I can.
Well-
Mhm.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ruthie.
Thank
Thank you.
Working here 20 years. And then I was a student. How about yourself? Not exactly like this, no. This is a little different. It's rather unique. Think of, there, yeah, it just, yeah, no, this has been kind of crazy.
I feel like I
And
should
then
tell.
last night with, the email,
Yeah.
the information, and then there was the, police activity, and all that, and that complicated things
I
too.
feel like I should tell them my tuberculosis story for the people who are watching. So when I was in graduate school, right, I worked on tuberculosis. So I had a cold when I gave my defense. So I would cough during my defense. I know, no one likes a TB researcher who coughs. thanks to those who are tuning in online. We're gonna start probably a couple minutes after 12:30 to make sure everyone can get online or come to D106. We're right now an empty room, so you could, if you folks want to come over, you're welcome to do that.
I run digital media services. So we have the studio and
on in.
Our presenter is still on his way. He has put this between a couple meetings, so we're gonna wait a few more minutes, but we're gonna get started pretty soon. So stay tuned.
Cool.
No one came to college today.
It's like they were told to stay away.
The people online can hear you, just that.
Okay.
They can't see you.
They can't see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you. Hi.
Okay, everyone can hear everything.
Oh, so I
20-something people.
just 20-something.
Yeah, so this is the speaker. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So I'll give you a couple minutes to, or a couple seconds to take a breath. My name is Jennifer Pang. I'm the outreach director at the Science and Math Institute here in Bellevue College in the Science Division. Thank you so much for coming. We're happy to provide a little bit more information about the outbreak that is happening in King County. So I would like to thank the Office of Academic Affairs and the Multicultural Services. They are the co-presenters for the Science Cafe, this particular Science Cafe series. Thank you to Dave from Digital Media Art to help us with the live streaming. We have never live streamed in the past. I do want to mention that we are not recording this for to disseminate out later, because we believe that the information what we have today is good, will also be changing over the next couple of weeks. So we thought it would be better if people just go ahead and keep updated by the King County Public Health site is probably the best place to get your information right now if you live in this area. I think that's it. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Reza Farough. He is a biology instructor here and was a bench scientist in his previous life before coming here, so we're happy to have him. We will be doing questions and Q&A. If you have questions, there's a chat function on the right hand of your screen on the YouTube channel, so you can go ahead and put your questions there. We will hopefully have time to answer those. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to also thank the same team that helped with putting this together in such a short notice. So let's start with the first slide, and the first slide is just knowing a little bit about viruses and what they are, what they do. So viruses in general are classified into families. And this classification are typically based on certain characteristics that viruses have. Characteristics at the level of genes, characteristics at the level of a shell around them that we call envelope. And the naming of the viral families are typically based on the location they were found or based on their appearances. So coronavirus family name is based on its appearance, which is resembling crown, and corona in Latin means crown. So here you can see 4 individual COVID-19 viruses. So the question that typically comes up is, are coronaviruses new viruses? And the answer is no. They have been around for thousands of years, perhaps millions of years. And the reason that public does not talk much about coronaviruses is because the majority members of coronavirus families, they cause very mild common cold with the symptoms that you're all familiar, including runny nose, sore throat, etc. Now, having said that, there are 3 outcast members of the coronavirus families, and the 3 members are SARS coronavirus, cause of SARS disease. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. MERS coronavirus, the cause of MERS. MERS stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And of course, the one that we're all here to talk about is SARS coronavirus 2. Initially, when it was discovered, was named novel, and for novel coronavirus. And the reason they assigned 2019, because it was discovered December 29 of 2019. Another name that they use for this virus is COVID-19 virus. So COVID-19 is the disease. COVID-19 virus is the virus that caused the disease. So I try to use the word, the term COVID-19 virus in my talk today. This is pretty informative slide, taking these 3 undesirable members of the family. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is this last, the bottom row. So COVID-19 virus, and this, by the way, this slide was prepared March 2nd, 2020. That's a few days ago, and already all this number has changed. As of early this morning, when I checked, the number of cases has passed 100,000. And the number of countries that are involved has increased to 86. So as you see, things are evolving fast, and the information becomes obsolete very quickly. The good news about this slide is that the rate of death is significantly lower than both SARS and MERS. But the concern is that the virus spread very rapidly from people to people. As you can see also by the number of countries that are involved. How did it all start? There's a concept in epidemiology and in medicine called zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases refer to the diseases that are transmitted from animals to human. COVID-19 is one of those zoonotic diseases. In terms of how it started or where it started, we know that where it started. It started in a fish market that also sold live animals in a city of 11 million people called Wuhan in China. So the location is pretty much mapped out. But in terms of what animal was the cause, there's a lot of controversy, and the jury is still out there. Basically, the way they decide what animal is involved, they have isolated the coronavirus from animals that were in that market. So, and then they analyzed their genes, and they also isolated the human COVID-19 and compared their genes. And turned out that the highest match were between the human COVID-19 virus and animal coronaviruses were between pangolin, which is shown here, and also bat and snakes. But again, the jury is still out there. We don't know why. We don't know what the real cause was, or what the real animal was involved in transmission of the disease. There are also conspiracy theories out there. There's a book by famous Dean Koontz, a novel writer, who was written back in 1989. And the book is basically, in short, the story is that the military, in a military lab in China, and more specifically in the city of Wuhan, that they were working on bioweapons. The virus escaped, and the virus was called Wuhan 400. Also, there are current theories. One that you most have heard by Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, who believes that the COVID-19 is the escaped bioweapon from a lab. So let's get away from the conspiracy theories and talk about how does the COVID-19 infect human? What happens? Before talking about going more into detail and talking about the COVID-19 virus mode of infection, there is a point about viruses has to be made. Both infectious viruses and bacteria, they, in order to multiply, they enter the body. The difference is that a bacterium can divide on its own. It has all the machinery, for example, in your bloodstream, divide and multiply and increase in number. Whereas viruses, in contrast, all the viruses, regardless of what family they come from, and entering the body alone is not enough for them to multiply. In order to multiply, they have to enter the cells in the body and use the host enzymes and other machineries in order to multiply. So what happens with COVID-19, the mode of entry into the body is typically through respiration. So it enters through the mouth, goes through the throat, and then goes to the lower respiratory system, which is the lungs. When it enters the lungs, what happens is the immune system doesn't sit still. It starts fighting back. The immune system gets activated to prevent the entry of the virus into the cells. So what does the lungs look like. The air enters through these airways, and when it enters through the airways, the lung has these sacs called alveoli, and these are very, very thin walled sac. They're thinner than a thickness of a, let's say, sheet of paper. So the reason they're so thin is to allow the air, once they're in the sac, to go through the wall of the sac and then enter the blood capillary, the blood circulation, and this is for the purpose of oxygen to be distributed in the body. So what happens is when the COVID-19 enters the body, within these sacs that you can see here, and it's filled with air pretty much, there are also immune cells, defense cells, that they are fighting to prevent the virus to get into these cells in the wall. Okay. Immune system is a double-edged sword. While it's working in our favor to get rid of the viral particle and prevent them from getting into these cells, in the process, the immune system releases what's known as cytokines. These are proteins that are released by our own immune system when it gets activated. The purpose of cytokines serve many different purposes. So, for example, one of the purposes is to send a message to other immune cells in the body and say, hey, I'm fighting this virus, come and help me. And in the process, those cytokines sometimes are so powerful that damage our own system. For example, in this case, they can cause permeability of these blood capillaries. And when these blood vessels, small capillaries, they become permeable, the fluid goes backward. It's just think of backing up your kitchen sink. So the fluid that is supposed to be inside these capillaries start filling the chamber, right? And when the fluids start filling the chamber, there is a condition happens, which in medicine, they call it ARDS. Stands for Acute Respiratory Distress Syndrome. And ARD is not something, it's a very general term. It's not just something that has to do with COVID-19 alone. For example, when people have sepsis, when people have pneumonia, ARDS is one of the complications. And the hallmark of the ARDS is that the person starts having difficulty breathing in and breathing out. So how do we protect ourselves? CDC recommendation is washing hands more than 20 seconds and washing really well your hands between the fingers, and touching the elevator button using knuckles, good sleep to have immune system. So those are some of the recommendations that CDC and WHO have for people to stay safe. One of the questions that routinely pops up is, are face masks effective? The short answer is both yes and no. N95 mask, for example, one of the highly advertised masks, has a pore size of 300 nanometer. The pore size of coronavirus is only 125 nanometer. So just doing a simple math, the virus has the ability to crawl or to go through the mask. But the good news is that the mode of transmission is typically through sneeze droplet and let's say cough droplet, and cough droplets are larger than 300 nanomolar. So, and typically not a single virus, but multiple viruses attached to it. So it is effective in that sense that it prevents the entry of the virus into the individual. How do we diagnose the virus? Again, this is another important point that most people are not aware. The size of viruses are very small, as I mentioned earlier. When you compare infectious agents, for example, bacteria and viruses, bacteria are about 2,000 nanometer in size, 1,000 to 2,000 nanometer. And typically you can stain them and you can observe them under regular light microscope. These light microscopes are available pretty much in every hospital's lab. In fact, we have these light microscopes in our labs here at Bellevue College, so pretty straightforward to see bacteria under the light microscope with little expertise. But when it comes to viruses, when you hear that they say people are, or the patient is COVID-19 positive, they don't take the sample and take it and look under the electron microscope and see the viral particle and say it's positive. The way they do the diagnosis are molecular biologic and biochemical testing. Basically, it's an indirect way of detecting. So this is this test, which is called PCR-based test, is the most common universal test right now that is used to detect the virus. If you have questions about the techniques, I can answer that during the Q&A session, but just to tell you how it works briefly, you take the sample from the patient, and if the pieces of virus are there, pieces of COVID-19 virus, genetic material is there, what you do, you use a machine called PCR to amplify that piece to the level that with the naked eye you can see them. So this observation is done by the naked eye, but what you see, it's not a virus, you see a bunch of the bands. These bands corresponding to genetic material of the virus. So let's look at this test. Lane that is indicated with letter L is just a marker, just to see the right size of the gene that you're interested in. Lane 1, 2, 3 are samples from 3 different patients. And lane 4, which is indicated with letter P, is just positive control, meaning it's just a piece of virus we put in a test tube and amplify. And N is negative control, meaning that this has to be, you know for sure that this is not a virus. Okay? So these 2 pieces are to show that your test is accurate. So when you look at this profile, what you can say is all 3 patients had the virus, but the virus load is higher in patient number 2, and then would be number 1, and finally the least amount would be in number 3. Another biochemical test is immunobased test. Again, this is an indirect test, and what you do here, you look for the viral protein presence instead of the genetic material, or you look for the presence of the antibody, which is a protein that human makes in response to the virus. Interestingly, just recently, a company in Singapore, as of 2 days ago, was able to develop an immunoassay kit And therefore, now we can do analysis for detection of the virus. If you want to compare the two tests, the immunoassay versus the PCR-based, and see what are the advantages and disadvantages, the advantage of PCR-based test is that it's already established, it's out there. Every country that right now is using that test to diagnose. It's the mainstream test. But the disadvantage of that test is when the patient is recovered from COVID-19, you cannot tell if the patient had the virus. Whereas the advantage of immunoassay kit, which really hasn't been expanded yet, is that even if patient recovers from the virus, let's say 2 months to 3 months, sometimes up to even 6 months, you test their blood, you would be able to tell that they were infected. So in terms of keeping track of the total number of cases, this is a very powerful asset. So is cure and treatments are available? The answer is that right now, the treatment is called supportive care, pretty much. And supportive care is basically when you get a cold at home, you do the supportive care. You stay home and rest, you take ibuprofen for your headache, and that's pretty much the same. The supportive care in the hospital is for the patient who are having ARDS, for example, where their lungs is pretty much compromised. It has additional element, and the additional element is oxygen mask and sometimes ventilator. They put the patient on the ventilators. So the majority of treatments is basically supportive treatment. However, when an unusual infectious agents like COVID-19 happen, physicians do a lot of trial and errors, even to the point that they throw the kitchen sink into trying to solve the problem. So based on educated guess and trial and error, they have tried a number of drugs that have antiviral property. And among all this drug, the one that seems giving some promising is this drug called remdesivir. Usually any drugs that have VIR at the end, it means it's antiviral drug. The reason they chose this particular drug, and right now, as of 2/25, there is a clinical trial in University of Nebraska Medical Center with patients who are significantly impacted with COVID-19. And the reason they chose this particular antiviral because it has shown helping patients who had SARS and MERS, the other two members of the coronavirus family. And also, it has been successful in helping the Ebola patient, even though Ebola patients are not in the same category, but they have some characteristics that is similar or common. That's why they chose this. But the one that I like the best when I was doing the literature review is one that's done by Chinese. As you know, China is taking the brunt of this outbreak, and they are really ahead of the curve in terms of trying different treatments. For example, they built 2 makeshift hospitals in a matter of 12 days, and each hospital has 1,000 beds. So, and it's exclusively for patients with COVID-19. And again, reading the literature, what really caught my eyes is this last treatment that's been done in China. It's called convalescent plasma therapy. What it is as following. They collected plasma from blood of the patients that were recovered from COVID-19. And these are 2,000 patients, a large pool of patients. So then what they did is took that plasma and injected to 11 patients who were in the midst of having their infection. And these 11 patients were all had the lungs involved, and they were in pretty bad shape. Even the virus had invaded the lung cells, had entered the bloodstream to infect more cells. And they saw that using this treatment, the patient significantly recovered within 6 or 7 days. Of course, 11 people is a very small sample size. They have to do more, but it looks a really promising approach. The risk of plasma therapy is the risk of plasma therapy is that you don't know these 2,000 patients had other viral in their system, such as hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, etc. That opening up a new can of worms. So. Is COVID-19 an epidemic or a pandemic? Definition of epidemic is the rapid spread of an infectious disease in a population over a short period of time. And pandemic is when an epidemic goes rampant and involve multiple continents. In a way, the line is kind of blurred, but and also the argument between WHO and experts in the field has been very blurred. Experts in the field, they believe that COVID-19 is already a pandemic, whereas WHO, which is World Health Organization, wants to call it an epidemic outbreak and is not declaring it as a pandemic yet. There seems to be a lot of political implication behind this it's beyond the scope of this talk, but it has to do with when I was listening to WHO directors talking about the situation. They were saying that when it's an epidemic, we can contain it. It's all about containment. But when we switch to pandemic, it's about management of the condition. And again, reading between the line, I don't know if my conclusion is right, but if it becomes a pandemic, there is larger implication of, for example, military involvement in quarantining people that they want, etc. Maybe that's why they don't want to switch the name. Now, when I showed this slide on last Wednesday, and the room was full, everybody laughed. And I thought, sometimes you want to show something and you really have a different intention. So my intention actually wasn't showing this for people to laugh. The intention was that to tell you that they did a poll, and I don't know how scientifically accurate the poll was, but 38% of the people who were interviewed in that poll, and these are all beer drinkers, they said that they will not drink Corona. And the reason for that is because of the name Corona that brings up the association with the coronavirus infection. So point is that a lot of businesses are hurting, and Jen can tell you more about it. And So at this point, I want to stop here, and maybe Jen, you want to tell them more about?
Yeah, and then we have some questions from Reza from the floor. I have a background in infectious disease myself. I was a tuberculosis researcher for 7 years, and so I feel like I have a fairly good grasp around public health issues. A couple things that we want folks to consider is that if people haven't traveled, have traveled more than 14 days ago and are not sick, and do not have symptoms, they will not be infectious. There is some research to say people with mild symptoms are infectious, but if there are no symptoms at all and there's no traveling, then you shouldn't be worried. One of the other things that I think is already impacting local businesses is that particularly Asian restaurants, but I think even now other restaurants in the Puget Sound, because people are worried about being in crowded spaces, they aren't going to patron those smaller businesses. So we would, it'd be nice if folks could, for those who can afford it, continue to support local restaurants by getting maybe takeout instead of eating in, if you have concerns. The other, I can't remember what the other thing I was going to say. Generally, the recommendations are just to stay healthy as you can be. I know with all the things that have happened at school this week, it's been fairly stressful, so to do things, maybe meditate or make sure to get a lot of sleep. Those kinds of things really help boost your immunity in a way that is will help you, even if you are exposed, maybe make you less susceptible to getting the virus. So we want people to, while they are maybe more at home than at the college, to consider just doing things like wiping down counters. Be careful about if you do have symptoms, don't come into contact as little contact with kind of older folks, because they tend to be a little bit more susceptible. Just kind of healthier behaviors in general. So I'm going to invite Reza back. I'm going to say thank you to him first. We have about 60 people streaming online. So that is incredible for this first attempt. So thank you to Dave for making this happen. So I'm going to say the first question we have is the 90,000 cases you talked about of COVID-19, is that just this year? And also, is the death rate that is being reported out also just for this year?
Okay. Yeah, so the 19,000 that I mentioned is actually has gone, last I heard, was gone over 100,000. And this is Johns Hopkins University, probably is one of the sources if you want to check. They keep track by, I believe, getting information from CDC, from WHO, and also probably they get information from the countries that are impacted. So the number is what these official centers receive. And then there are a couple interesting websites. In fact, one of them that I was very impressed is if you go to Bellevue College webpage, there is a young gentleman by name Avi Schiffman, I believe. You'd see on the and he is a student at Bellevue College. I think
he's a Running Start student.
Yeah, Running Start student, and he's a 17-year-old at Mercer Island High School. He keeps the tab by basically bringing, linking again all this information from different sites to his site that he has control over the server, and you can follow what the total number of cases is. So this is the total number of cases that have been identified since the identification of the virus, which was December 29 of 2019, and the number is counting. So, so tomorrow you go to these websites, it's over 100,000. So that's one thing. The other one is the death rate, is this just this rate? Again, the death rate, the way the calculation was done here, good, here's that. So, and again, a lot of epidemiologists who are really guru in this field, they may disagree with this simplification. So the simplification is this. You take the, in this case, you take the number of death and divide them by total number, and you come up with that death rate. Now, why, and again, quickly answering your question, it's from the December 29th till today, well, till, for this data is March 2nd. Why the epidemiologists don't like this, and there are better ways? Because the way the virus, the COVID-19, impact people is very different depending on age and even sex. And probably ethnicity, I think, is also they're considering a factor. So for example, they have seen that below age 9, the death rate is 0 so far, unless something new happens that I'm not aware. But till a couple days ago, no child below age 9 who has got, and they were positive, about 0.9% was the value that I remember, none of them died, right? But when you go to age 60 and over, and especially 70 to 79, and you look at, you take that and calculate the death rate, this number from 3.4 jumps to about 18%, 14 to 18%, somewhere around that line. So, so age plays a really important factor. If you take other factors such as pre-existing conditions, especially respiratory issues and diabetes was another one, then the risk always, the risk increases. Any other questions?
We don't know. My understanding is we don't know why kids seem to be less affected or why they have less disease than adults. Is that what you have also heard? I don't know.
Yeah. So this is an interesting observation that why, and we don't know yet exactly, but it's an interesting observation because do they have, for example, question came up like this among the experts, do they have factors in their blood or in their body that makes them less susceptible to the, because typically immune system takes time to develop, right? So if you just want to say their immune system is stronger, no, that's not really true. But there was one conversation that was brought up that I was reading among experts was that what if, because their immune system is not as good as our immune system, it sort of
the cytokine storm might not
yeah,
happen.
the cytokine storm that it's doesn't happen, and they might get it, but the symptom is so mild and it passes. So that's an interesting theory, but we don't know.
So we have another question around susceptibility. So are smokers being disproportionately affected by COVID-19? Are there populations that seem to tolerate the virus better? So aside from children do seem, I feel like that's why we're not seeing most of the elementary schools closing, but there have been some of that.
Right.
Are smokers disproportionately affected?
Yeah. So I can't remember if I focused on smoker being disproportionately affected, but I know that if you consider that certain respiratory diseases are higher among smokers, then you can make that jump that they are impacted more. But I don't know the answer if they are. Are there population that seem to be tolerate the virus better? We talked about the children. Also, what they found was interesting is the male gets by little percentage more infected than female, right, in general. But what was intriguing was when it comes to dying from COVID-19, it's almost twice death rate for male compared to female. So they contributed to different things, it's all hand waving, all theories that why it happens, and one of the ideas is it could be the hormonal, other ideas could be that in many countries females stay home more than males, so they're less exposed. But also another thing I read, and I should read more about it, they have seen that the spread in, it has happened in sub-Saharan Africa, but seems that the spread of the disease in Africa is lower than the rest of the world. So who knows?
I also want to be clear that this is a situation that has only been happening for about 8 weeks.
Exactly.
So it's kind of amazing that we even know as much as we do about this particular virus, as we do like the DNA sequence, that there's been the virus isolated. Those are all things that typically take a much longer time. So we are in some ways ahead of the curve, although the virus is definitely, having an impact. I have a different kind of question here that is, can domesticated and wild animals get and transmit COVID-19? And I'm happy to take a stab at this, but you can.
Sure. So I can
first.
just briefly say something, and then you can add to it if you want. The short answer is the wild animal, of course, we talked about, and domesticated animal also, they're known that to have coronaviruses in general, getting infected with the family of coronaviruses. And as I mentioned earlier, that bats, snake, and pangolin is, so the worry is that right now, the worry is that people start killing these animals, because in the past it happens. When SARS happened, a lot of people were killing civet cat, which was the cause of SARS. And the reason was that the SARS virus was found in civet cat, and the genetic comparison showed 99% match to human SARS. And in this case, the match is so far 90%. But there is a lot of, as I was reading more in detail, there's a lot of actually issue with the sequencing. I can give you one example quickly if there's time. So what happened was this. This is actually an embarrassing miscommunication. So the story is this. When they sequenced the human SARS, human COVID-19 virus in China, it was sequencing done in the lab, and they also sequenced the coronavirus from the pangolin in the lab, in the same lab, right? And the pangolin was, the virus was isolated from a pangolin that was in that seafood market, right? So the people in the lab, then they send the sequence to bioinformatics group. So remember, both speak Chinese, same language, so it just shows that even you speak the same language, how the miscommunication happened. So when they gave it to the bioinformatics people, the sequence of the virus that they give to bioinformatics people was only the small portion corresponding to the binding of the virus to the host cell, not the entire virus. So it's a piece of the gene. And bioinformatics people didn't understand that, or the miscommunication was there, so they thought that it's the entire gene. And when they sequenced it, they say, wow, there is 99% a match between pangolin and human COVID-19. And in fact, it was published. And everything now gets just published once you have the data. And then later, when they went more into detail, they realized, no, what they had sent them, it was only a portion of the virus, not the entire thing. And so, but go ahead.
So I would say that I was reading the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, is our federal kind of public health entity. So the recommendations are to not, if you do get sick and display symptoms, to not cuddle or try and get someone else in your household to take care of your pets. I think partly because it did come from an animal, we called it an animal reservoir, so that is where the virus originally came from, and we're not as sure about how that transmission, it is unlikely to go back and forth, but we just want to make sure that we keep it a human virus now. So I think that is the recommendation from the CDC. The CDC site is pretty great because it outlines if you have specific interests. So like there's a specific one around information for schools and that kind of thing. That being said, because we are in King County, we have an excellent public health system here. I would keep most apprised with them. I have a couple more questions from our vast viewership. Why was the name changed from coronavirus to COVID-19?
Okay.
So we'll go with that
Right.
first.
So you remember early on I mentioned that coronavirus family is a family that under that family you have all these different names which belong to that family. So when we say coronavirus, we should actually say coronavirus family. That's the right terminology. And then what happened is when they discovered this particular member of the family, they called it a novel coronavirus 2, right? They call it, what was the name? I had it here because I want to make actually a point on this. It was earlier. Maybe, because this is a good point. Yeah,
That one, yeah.
that one. So do you see, it was actually they called initially one of the name was novel coronavirus because it was a new member of the family, and then the group of experts. There's an article in Science about it that how this virus is spreading, and sometimes scientists are fighting to pick up the name. So, so the problem happened was that the group of people, experts who are naming these viruses, they said, let's choose this name. SARS coronavirus 2. So the original member, well, one of the members that you all know about SARS coronavirus, they consider this like SARS coronavirus 1, and this would be SARS coronavirus 2, and then if more shows up, 3, 4, so forth, right? But then they said, no, wait, we shouldn't call it SARS coronavirus, and we should call it COVID-19. The reason is this name may put stigma and scare people, because especially people who experienced SARS in the past, because this was really deadly, right? It didn't spread everywhere around the world, but it was very, remember, 10% death rate. So they say it's a traumatic name, maybe we shouldn't call it. So there's a lot of argument like that. And it looks like that COVID-19 is the name is used. But again, please make distinguish between COVID-19 is the disease, like you say AIDS is a disease, and COVID-19 virus is the cause of the disease, like HIV virus is the cause of AIDS.
All right, we've got one more very practical question.
What is it? Okay.
Ready? We have one very practical question. I'm supposed to go to a restaurant opening on Sunday. Since there will be more than 10 people, do you recommend we not attend?
You know, I can't answer that, but I can just tell you this. This was one of the last thing I read about a question that come along the same line that you've asked. So they were saying that with SARS, which also was a respiratory infection, what the study showed was that if you, and also with influenza, which are from completely different family member of viruses, but they cause similar, respiratory infection, the recommendation for those is that if somebody has, for example, influenza virus, and they've done this study and they know that that's the outcome, if you are within 6 feet of the person for 10 minutes, and the person sneezing and coughing, there's a pretty good chance that you get it. 6 feet, 10 minutes, right? And also, there is another study with COVID-19 virus. And this study I've heard from people who are actually on ground zero and working right now with the virus. They're trying to, get more information about the virus. They're saying that the virus, once it's on inanimate object, let's say doorknob, for example, it can last for about 9 days. So if, let's say, you touch that doorknob, stick your hand in your nose, pick up your nose, then there is likelihood that you can be infected.
I think also it's important, I went and talked to a classroom earlier this week, and someone asked, is it irresponsible to go out in public, or or certain actions? And I think that we have to recognize our own privilege in terms of the level of education that we have, and all the being able to access these kinds of informational sessions. So, and that we're all just trying to do the best thing, and that and it's a constantly changing situation, and that we're all just trying to make the best choices for ourselves. So I think we would suggest that you do the thing that makes the most sense for you. Is there so the last thing I have, which I have some resources, and you might have some as well. Is there anywhere else that we can hear similar information as this is not recorded? So I do want to be clear that this has not been recorded. It will not be disseminated, partly because this is so rapidly evolving situation. So we were worried about disseminating information that people will come back to later that might not be as up to date. So I've said the King County Public Health website is very good. They are updating that. The last update, I believe, was yesterday. So they are, I think, almost on a daily basis, they are updating that information. The CDC website, particularly those with special interests, is also very good. Do you have the WHO site, obviously the World Health Organization, if you have loved ones around the world, that is a good global situation, or a global outlet for information that could be really useful. Do you have other ones that you really like?
They're all good.
I believe the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, if you follow them on social media, has been kind of keeping up, and it has been disseminating out some very interesting bits of information around what's happening scientifically. So I would suggest follow those.
I just have one other thing, and this is was reading. So this was based on reading with interviews with EMTs, first respondent, around the board, especially places that they have high infection with COVID-19 virus. So when they ask them that when you go to home of the people, when they call 911 and you get there, what do you see? The first symptom, the symptoms that you see in the patient. And they were 3 things that they mentioned. And the reason I want to bring this up is because I have a student also who is an EMT, and she was telling me yesterday that people have just minor headache, they take the phone, call 911, and it really ties up their resources, right? So then you would say, okay, if I don't call 911, stay home and take ibuprofen, and I don't feel better, what happens? So basically, same kind of things happens around the world. People were told not to go to the doctor, stay home, and they get rest, and then sometimes they get worse, right? Complication with the breathing happens. So the 3 things that they see let's say a loved one calls 911 that, the patient at the house is really sick, are these three things. They see high fever that the patient has. The second thing they see is that the difficulty in breathing, both inhalation and exhalation. So those were the signs that the EMT noticed. And interestingly, they don't see any runny nose. So basically, no mucus, and therefore the three things are high fever or intermittent fever. Second is inhalation and exhalation difficulty, and the third thing is dry cough. And dry cough is to the point that the patient complains from pains of repeated coughing. So those are the three signs that EMT sees when they see the patient.
Great. Oh, we have one more question from here.
Yeah, can you speak to the number of tests that were performed in the state of Washington, the availability and the rate of testing generally on this topic?
How many people have
Yeah.
been
How
tested?
many people have been tested?
Uh-huh.
What percentage came up
Yeah.
positive, and how available, and what's the strategy about testing?
Yeah. So the number are changing. I know it's over 100 now. No, not in Washington, but in US it's over 100, and the
Cases.
number in
That's cases.
cases, yeah. The numbers out there, I don't want to give you, but it's nothing like, what it is
I'm
in.
talking how many people have been tested overall?
Oh,
Those
that
100
I
cases
don't
to-
know. I don't know. But this is a very good point, because they're talking about that whether we're ready in case it explodes, in terms of number. Do we have enough kits? And remember, the test is that PCR-based test. And do we have enough kits? Do we have enough? And the answer looks like that we're not really ready. If it, mushrooms and if it explodes, the number of cases. How many? Pretty much when they say someone is positive and the case are recorded, is using that PCR based. So, but one question that comes up is 80% of people who get COVID-19, that's the good news, right? They have mild symptoms and their immune system recovers, right? So they would never even go to the doctor to be tested. So the number is much higher.
And they shouldn't go to the doctor to be tested.
Hmm?
I don't think they should go to the doctor to be tested unless you have the three things that
Unless-
Reza talked about,
Right,
right?
unless they get really sick, then they would go see a doctor. But, so for example, I was reading last night the first case in state of Washington, in Snohomish was. And this individual was 35 years old, right? And pretty much in a good health. The reason he went to see a doctor was he read in the news that there's spread of this disease in China, and he had visited shortly before. And he started having dry coughs, and that was his main concern, and fever. But the fever, when they checked him, because I was reading all the details, it wasn't really that high, so they called it subjective fever. But coughing was there. The blood pressure seems to be okay. The only number that was different was his, he had a really fast heart rate, it's called tachycardia. It was 110 beats per minute, something like that. So that was the only thing, and also the cough, right? So he is sent home. They give him some ibuprofen and send him home, I guess. But then, because he had described those, they do the testing, that PCR based, and they want him back the next day. So the next day when he goes back, he's hospitalized, and I think it was in Everett, the Providence Hospital in Everett. That's where he was hospitalized. And so he was quarantined. You know, doctors go with all masked up to see him and constantly taking samples. And he started developing, taking a daily chest X-ray and testing, and he started developing the ARDS that we talk about. So he was getting oxygen supply. They took swabs of, this is interesting, they took swabs of nose, mouth, throat, and anal swab to see if the digestive system involved, and in all those it was positive. So, and the patient then was put on one of those antiviral drug that we talked about, and he improved. But he's one of those who went down the path. Probably his health, his age was around 35, and that he recovered. So how many people in the state of Washington, again, die of this depends on the age range. Data is out there, but I don't want to give you a number that I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you, Reza. So fever, dry cough, and difficulty breathing in and out.
In and out, right.
So so treat the cold like you otherwise would at home unless you get all three of those things, is what I would say.
Especially the cough increasing in number, and it's a dry cough.
Persistent dry cough.
And before I heard this, I was thinking maybe it's time to boost my immunity, but now that you're saying maybe that's going to be the wrong strategy.
No, you do want to boost your immunity, but you want to boost it like by sleeping, by eating right, continue to exercise. That will help keep your cortisol down, which is a stress response. So we are way over time, but thank you very much. Thank you very much for tuning in, and stay safe out there. Take care. Thank you.
Well, I have to go to a meeting.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I know you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, bye.
Sorry about that.